Today we are still in the Qing period of Taiwan, when the Qing Empire controlled parts of Taiwan. We're looking at shipwrecks, in particular one very famous shipwreck, and we're also going to look at a story of Americans storming the beaches of Kending. So, John, I remember we were having a discussion a while back, and you told me that more foreigners ended up in Taiwan due to shipwrecks than any other reason.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation.
Formosa Files.
Absolutely. It's not even close. If we're looking at the mid-1860s, there might have been 25 foreigners on the island, but there are many, many more arriving unwillingly shipwrecked.
And of course, the very first known Westerners to arrive on Taiwan, 1582, they were shipwrecked. They were Portuguese and Spaniards sailing from Macau to Nagasaki, and they got stuck on Taiwan. So being shipwrecked on Taiwan has a noble tradition.
Very noble indeed. Yes, it's a deadly coastline, little charted, unlit, no lighthouses at the time, treacherous currents and winds, very few safe harbors. And it wasn't much fun when you got to land either, was it?
There were some very hostile individuals.
Yes, and not so much the East Coast with the indigenous people there. I mean, most of the shipping was going up and down the strait. Even along the western coastline, it was bad news. You'd be stripped of your clothes, robbed of your possessions, and what have you. There are lots of accounts. One of them is from Pickering, who we mentioned last time.
Right. Pickering was the young Englishman who was in Taiwan in the 1860s with the Imperial Maritime Customs Service. And that imperial means the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service. And as a young man in his mid-20s, he was basically in charge of trade for southern Taiwan.
Yes. He went up from Kaohsiung to Anping, Tainan. He has some good stories. Yeah, there were even the pirate villages not that far away. He mentions one about 6 miles north of Tainan. So the fact that you could find pirates so close to the capital at the time tells you about the extent of Chinese authorities' rule or willingness to rule.
We have a quote here from Pickering, actually. He wrote this: "Cruel were the tender mercies of the Chinese fisher folk, even amongst a law-abiding population scattered along the seacoast between Taiwan-Fu or Tainan and Takao or Kaohsiung. Further north, the wild and lawless settlers cultivated wrecking as a profession."
Yes. We mentioned last time that the local authorities weren't that happy with foreigners. You had the customs people taking some of their possible graft money. And also there was the question of extraterritoriality, which gave some protection to foreigners in the treaty ports. So there's one occasion, Pickering says, about 24 Europeans, almost totally naked, were brought into his office in Tainan. They'd been wrecked, stripped of everything. They'd spent the night covered with sand to keep them warm. The next day, they walked to a small town where a kind local magistrate gave them food, small sum of money, rice bags for a makeshift clothing. Okay, so you just cut a hole in it, and that's good for your head to poke through. And what have you. And they go on their way. But as they're walking back to civilization, they're passing through a coastal village, and they get robbed of everything again, including their new garments made out of sacks.
This is interesting because most of the time when I've read accounts of shipwrecks, they have always mentioned the reaction by the indigenous people of Taiwan. But very rarely have I heard stories of the Chinese Han settlers in Taiwan and their reaction to shipwrecks. Usually it's like, the wild savage tribes came down and butchered, but the Chinese were equally interested in messing with shipwreck survivors.
Yes, these village areas along the coast are quite different from your farming folk inland. They're a mix of professions, shall we say, and they have a long, long tradition of taking gifts that come from the ocean.
Right, right. But it is also true that if you were unlucky enough to be shipwrecked either on the East Coast or further down south, what would be now the beach areas of like Kending or Pingdong County, as it's called called. If you were unlucky to get shipwrecked there was a very good chance you'd be killed by indigenous people who didn't take kindly to anyone encroaching on their territory.
Yes, and the famous case is the 1867 rover. The rover incident, yeah.
The rover was a U.S. vessel, right?
Merchant ship, not that large. I think 14 people on board, 15.
And it wrecked off the coast of the far south of Taiwan.
Very far south. So Kenting, beach resort.
A beach resort.
Yeah, so this is the southernmost point of Taiwan. You look at a map and you've got the Hengchun Peninsula poking out. Now, offshore, there are rocks, quite treacherous. So the rover hit rocks offshore, drifted a little bit towards Kenting to the west, and they managed to get into boats and they made the coast. They got safely to the coast, but then, 14 of them got butchered, including the captain, his wife, and there was just one Chinese, I think a cook.
And this one Chinese cook managed to hoof his way back to Takao, or modern-day Kaohsiung, and tell the British what had happened. And the British forwarded the information on to the Americans.
Yes, of course, things take time, but the Americans are not on the island. The nearest consul is in Xiamen.
Okay, so the British hear about this massacre of survivors, and this is technically their turf, so they send a ship down to check out the situation and perhaps dish out a little bit of justice in their view.
Well, they want to go see what happens. They would assume there would be some survivors and they could negotiate ransom for taking them back.
Oh.
So the British ship, the HMS Cormorant, heads down from Takao to Kenting, and they put three small ships off to the beach. As soon as they arrive, they come under fire from unseen forces in the jungle.
Gunfire, or? These
are muskets.
Muskets. Okay, so the Aboriginal people had access to firearms at this point.
Oh, yes. The Aborigines in this area are not as wild as some of the ones high up in the mountains. They're, trading with the Chinese.
Right.
You have this landing party reaching the coast. One of them is actually Patrick Manson, the Scottish doctor who was instrumental in discovering mosquitoes as the vector for disease.
Right. Yes, I do remember him.
Okay. He'd come out just a few months before. So that's fun, isn't it? But just a few months on the job and you're sent down.
Getting shot at on a beach. Are there any casualties?
No, they made a hasty retreat and all was all right. But before they left, they pounded the jungle with some shells.
Okay, so let me see if I got this straight. The British hear about this American ship that has shipwrecked and the survivors were butchered from a Chinese cook who makes it back to Kaohsiung. They inform the Americans. The British decide to go check out the situation. They land some ships in Kenting, on Kenting's beaches. They get fired on by the locals, retreat, go back to their ship, bomb it with cannon fire, and sail back to their base, and that's it. That's the British response. The Americans, however, want a bit more of an aggressive military response. So from China is dispatched a ship with
two warships
with Marines on them. So these are Navy ships with a Department of Marines
and some Navy men as well.
How many soldiers in total?
About 180.
180 men roughly, Marines and Navy, sent from bases in China to deal with this problem in Kenting on the very south of Taiwan.
Yes. And Pickering is along as a interpreter.
Oh, yes. Our friend Pickering. He seems to get called on quite a bit for his linguistic skills. So do the Americans fare any better than their British cousins?
No, they spend a total of 6 hours on land. They're fired at. They return fire. Just one fatality, but unfortunately for the expedition, it's one of the leaders. It's Lieutenant Commander Mackenzie, and he was shot through the heart.
And we don't know how many casualties, or if there were any casualties on the native indigenous side.
Yeah, in his account, Pickering says they heard the wails of the warriors, but when they went into the bush, they couldn't find any bodies. So just one of the leaders. So at that stage, they've been looking for the Aborigines for 6 hours, but not really seen them. They're just getting ambushed and a bit of a wild goose chase. Also, some of the people are collapsing or delirious from heat.
Right. I was reading about this. They come to Kenting dressed in their woolen uniforms that are designed for like being on the high seas or, for general winter or North American climates. And if you haven't been to Kending, in the summer, it averages somewhere 36, 37 degrees centigrade. It's very, very hot.
Indeed, yes. By the way, bit of a tangent. This lone fatality, Mackenzie, he was the nephew of Commodore Matthew Perry, who opened Japan to the outside world, well, forced them open in the early 1850s.
It was not a willing opening. The Americans sailed their ships into Tokyo Bay and said, trade or we bomb.
Yeah, something like that. You've stripped out all the nuance, but yes, that was. So, a failed expedition. Pickering says in his wonderful account, Pioneering in Formosa, he says, unable to find any village, the Marines marched back to the boats and sailed away. They were going to return in the dry season when the jungle could be burned off. I don't think there is a dry season.
No, you cannot burn the jungle of Kending. It is, no, that's not going to work.
It makes you feel better when you're retreating, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess they were consoling themselves. But they do make a return.
Yes, in a way, yep. Pickering heads down a little bit later on a privately funded expedition. The family of the captain, they want the remains, they want the bones. Pickering, when he's down there negotiating for these, he also manages to rescue some other shipwrecked people, this time alive.
Nice.
But on his way back, he encounters this Chinese army. Qing authorities have finally decided to do something. And with this army is the American consul from Xiamen, and he's called Charles Le Gendre.
Now, when you say encounter, you mean he met ships. His ship met another ship.
Sorry, I should explain. They're actually going overland.
Okay.
Going by ship was not always the safest way.
Right. You don't want to get shipwrecked again.
You don't want to get shipwrecked. So,
So Pickering comes across a Qing army with this general. And this general, how would you pronounce his name again?
I'd say Gendre.
Okay. So what's interesting about him is he is a Frenchman who moved to America and signed up for the military, ended up becoming a general in the U.S. Civil War before becoming American consul at Xiamen.
Yes, and he was seriously wounded twice in the war. Lost his left eye, replaced with a glass one.
Okay. So what is he doing with this Chinese army?
Well, he is going to try and negotiate with the Aborigines to stop the practice of butchering shipwrecked sailors. Because it's not just about this one case, the rover. This is an ongoing problem.
Okay, yes. So this is interesting. The British tried bombing and shooting, and then the Americans tried bombings and shootings. But the one that is successful is a group of Chinese with one American who come in and talk, negotiate.
Yeah. Yes, well, Le Gendre has the reasonable assumption that any solution to this problem will need to involve the Chinese settlers living near the indigenous areas. The indigenous people are reliant on trade with their Chinese neighbors, for ammunition and other supplies. So it makes sense to include them in any negotiations.
Oh, interesting. So he had a broader concept of stuff. It seems like he was a smart man.
Yes, absolutely. Quite educated as well.
So he makes it. He makes it to the Aboriginal village and meets the chief.
Yes, he gets Pickering to come along with him.
Oh, Pickering gets to translate again, huh?
Yes, so they're back down to meet the Aborigine leader. I don't think we've said what tribe. We should. Paiwan.
Okay, the Paiwan live today. They kind of live further up in the mountains in southern Taiwan.
But the reason we've not mentioned Paiwan is because this story involves a tribe that's usually referred to as Koalat.
Okay.
It's not the whole group over the whole area.
A subdivision of...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they finally have negotiations. A little bit tricky, but they finally sign a draft treaty. In Pickering's book, he says Le Gendre put his glass eye to use during something of an impasse over the negotiations.
In what way? How did he use his glass eye?
There can't be any trickery on their part. He's taken out his magic eye and it's watching them.
Okay. Okay. So he and the local chief sign a contract and then they have a party.
Yes, some hardcore drinking, apparently, yes.
And it was agreed from then on that Western survivors of shipwrecks would not be dealt with harshly by local indigenous people.
That's right. So Gendre would make several more trips down to that area, one to ratify the treaty. And unfortunately, it's not long until the next incident in the area, the Mudan incident in 1871.
Right. And this time we're talking about a Japanese ship that crashes on the east coast of Taiwan.
Yes. Well, it's still down on the Hengchun Peninsula on the eastern side. Japanese ship, but actually it's Ryukyu. They're from Miyako Island in the Ryukyu chain.
Currently called Okinawa.
Yes. So, well, Okinawa is the best known of the islands, but you have a whole arc of islands from just 110 kilometers off the northeast coast of Taiwan. You have Yonaguni Island and then all the way up to Kyushu. So this is one of the southern islands in the Ryukyu chain. Sailors, and they get shipwrecked. After they land, they move inland and there's some problem and they end up mostly dead. 54 beheaded, just 12 survivors. So
okay, to recap, the French-American general has already secured a treaty with the indigenous people to not kill Westerners that shipwreck on Taiwan. But Japanese or Okinawan people have now had another shipwreck, and 54 of their sailors have been captured and beheaded by also some group of indigenous people. And now we've got another problem.
Absolutely, yes. Now, Gendre traveled to Taiwan and he was going to attempt to extend the treaty to cover, non-Westerners as well. He had some dispute with his superiors and then he ended up being employed by the Japanese.
Okay, so the Americans and other Westerners have been covered by a treaty, but the Japanese have not been afforded such protections. So what does Japan do?
Okay, let's look at the dates. We've got the Mudan incident, 71. The response, which will happen later, 74. They send an expedition to punish the murderers. So that's 3 years. It's a long time, isn't it?
Yes. And in between that period, Legendre goes back to Taiwan to try to negotiate a treaty that would also include the Japanese and other non-Westerners.
That's right. So there are negotiations going on during those years. The Gendre is not successful. The Japanese are not successful. The Qing authorities are rather dismissive. It's just like, well, it's outside our territory, nothing to do with us.
Interesting. So the Japanese do lodge like an official protest with the Qing and say, hey, this is unacceptable. And the Qing Empire goes, oh, that part of Taiwan is not really ours. It's wild territory. We can't be held responsible for it. And this makes the Japanese go, interesting.
Yes. I think it's also that they had their eye on it early on, but they had to go through the official steps of being a responsible power. But yes, certainly the Chinese claim that that's none of their business would encourage them, wouldn't it?
Definitely. So 3 years later, the Japanese do send troops to punish. How did that work out?
How did it work out? Okay, I'll give you some numbers, all right, from the Taiwan expedition of 1874. The strength of the Japanese and the Paiwan Aborigines involved. Okay, Japanese forces land, 3,600, 6 warships. We don't know how many Aborigines. The Japanese lost 12 men, 30 wounded. 561 died from disease. Aborigines, about 89 killed, many wounded. What strikes you about those numbers?
They're low.
Very low, right? Japanese just 12 killed, and on the Aboriginal side, 89.
So the Japanese didn't go nuts. They didn't completely just butcher everyone that they found.
Yes, and I'll give you another number too. They were there for 6 months.
Did they negotiate a treaty for Japanese shipwreck survivors?
No. They were there to colonize Taiwan. They took farm animals. While they're there, they started planting crops. They were researching the East Coast, and they were looking to make the southern part of Taiwan a Japanese colony. So the punitive aspect was a cover. That's why the numbers are so low. They generally restrained themselves. They didn't go wild.
Right. And this is way before Japan finally gets to take Taiwan as a prize in 1895.
That's right. So they were thinking about it much earlier. They're thinking that they can establish a settlement, but there's very strong resistance from the British, the Americans, and the Chinese. They don't like upsetting the apple cart. So the Japanese finally settle for the Chinese paying and indemnity for the original shipwrecking and their costs and having to revenge the killings.
So did the Qing Empire learn any lessons from this Japanese attempt at mini colonization? Did they start to understand that maybe they should fortify the island a little bit better, or they're going to get other people interested in taking parts of Taiwan?
Very slowly, yes. It would require another wake-up call a decade later. But yes, one of the responses to the Japanese incursion was to try to pacify Aboriginal areas. So they stepped up that, building roads into the areas, putting garrisons, pacifying them. It was unwelcome incursions into Aboriginal areas. One of the responses to the incident was building a lighthouse down in Ulanbi,
which still stands today and is a tourist attraction. I've been there a couple of times. It's actually quite a beautiful place to visit. It has a huge grassy area around it where you can hang out and have a picnic. You can check out the lighthouse.
Yes. So it was a joint effort run by the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, staffed by foreign lighthouse keepers. The first lighthouse keeper, an Englishman called George Taylor, he lived there from 1882 to 1887. It was an interesting time to be there, but also sad. It's sort of the twilight of authentic native life. And Aboriginal culture was being overwhelmed. Chinese settlers were moving in, military roads being put through. So Taylor, he could speak Taiwanese, and he learned the Paiwan language of the local indigenous people and had friendly relations with them.
And as I recall, they purchased the land for that lighthouse from the local Paiwan people.
Yes, they purchased it back in, probably 75. There was an overland expedition by a customs officer called Beasley. And quite a trip. They had to push themselves onto the Aborigines. They didn't want the foreigners, the Chinese and Beasley coming in. Smallpox, said keep out, worried about disease, you know.
So was it just a lighthouse, or was it also a military base?
Oh, okay. Good question. Just a lighthouse, but my goodness, it was well armed. The lantern at the top, it had steel shutters to protect it in case of attack. There were Gatling guns, a mortar, I think, cannon, and from the bungalows everywhere there was fortifications they could move without being shot, which they needed a couple of times. It came under attack from memory. Yeah, they had a staff of 8 men employed under a European gunner. So not a military base as such, but a heavily fortified and pretty well-armed lighthouse. And
they built it quite well because, as we noted, it's still there. And it was also attacked by the U.S. during World War II. It's a sturdy building.
It's a great spot, isn't it? It's the southernmost point of Taiwan. Worth a visit.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to leave it here. Today was mostly about the rover and the Mudan incident, and we didn't really have enough time to cover all of the interesting things in it. So if you're a student of history or interested, I definitely recommend that you look those things up. Thanks for listening. You can contact us by writing to formosafiles@gmail.com. I'm Eryk Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
Catch you next time.
Bye.